Great. Well, thank you all for coming. I'm really thrilled to introduce Daryl Daly. Daryl was one of my top students several years ago. She was a research assistant. She was a co-author. We wrote a piece together on citizen petitions that got a ton of attention. And Daryl is one of the few students I have who has gone to work in-house for a pharmaceutical company. And so I'm really thrilled that we can welcome Daryl, who can talk about her journey and maybe share some advice for all of us in and out of law school. So without further ado, Daryl Daly.
Thanks. Thank you, Michael. And it's very odd to call you Michael. It's Professor Carrier in my mind. So, and it will always be Professor Carrier. I'm really happy to be speaking with you all today. And let me tell you, when I sat in your shoes and when I was in law school, I always kind of I was trying to figure out the puzzle of like, how do people get to where they are and how do people get to those jobs? So I'm hoping that just by sharing my experience and some opportunities that are in the pharma industry, it will shed a little bit of light on maybe, potential pathways if folks are interested. There are so many different things you can do in the pharma industry and the in-house industry generally. And so I'm having, excuse me, I'm hopeful that this will be informative to folks. I know, especially in law school, and especially when you're a first year, the path always seems to kind of be like litigation focused and just going from a clerkship to a firm and very litigation heavy. And there's obviously a whole world of legal experience out there that is not anything related to litigation. So we'll share some of my thoughts and my experiences. And I can kind of start with going through, my journey of how I got to where I am right now. And I will preface that, BMS did not hire me for my PowerPoint skills. That is what our marketing department is for. And so, excuse my rudimentary slides, but I didn't want you to just stare at me for 30 minutes. So, I went to Rutgers undergrad, and I majored in nothing related to my job, nothing related to law. I was an art history major and an econ major. In fact, I did horrible in chemistry. So you can still be bad at science and go into pharma. I'm a testament to that. And then I went straight from Rutgers to Rutgers Law School. You're all in a great spot. When I was applying to law school, my parents were appalled that I was only applying to one school. And I said, I don't know why I would go to anywhere else. Rutgers is a great law school and it's right in our backyard. So I just can't imagine why I would even bother with something else. So I think that everyone who's sitting in in this room who's at Rutgers Law School, you're really in a great spot to get an amazing education. And one of the things I did when I was in school was, as Professor Carrier mentioned, was I wrote and I was a research assistant because it was an opportunity to explore something that was different from what we see in class every day. And also and to be quite honest, it makes your name stand out, right? It stands you out from everybody else who's doing a journal, who's doing moot court, finding ways to kind of set yourself apart in something a little bit unique definitely does give you something else to talk about when you are interviewing for positions or when you're thinking about next steps, because you can say, yes, I dove into this topic for this particular reason, and this is why I am different from everybody else who was on moot court, everybody else who was in journal. And I'll get to it a little bit later, but that publication was actually one of the driving forces to land me where I am today. So, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But just to give you an idea of kind of what I did in law school, I interned, and as most of you are probably looking for your 1L or 2L internships, my 1L internship was a little different. I decided to study abroad, and I did a class through Miami School of Law. And I also had an opportunity to take an internship with a family member who is a lawyer, not a barrister, in London. So I did kind of a little bit of work education my 1L year. It was more of like a fun summer. Whereas my second summer in law school, my 2L year, I happened to get an internship opportunity with Novo Nordisk. Novo Nordisk is a pharmaceutical company based in Princeton, and they are mostly diabetes products. Most of you are probably very familiar with them from Ozempic. They're all over the news these days. So that was really my first forte into pharma. and the shiny world of in-house life, as I saw it when I was a 2L intern, because you really could see the inner workings of a business. Also, at the time when I interned for them, they had like just won an award for like best company to work for in New Jersey, and it was all these things where you see everybody having a great time at working at this company versus the differences that I saw from some of my fellow colleagues at school who were interning at law firms. I just had a very different experience where they were the summer associate life. It was very different as a intern in a pharmaceutical company where I was getting kind of little bits and pieces of the business, as opposed to a lot of the experience again of many of my friends in law school were litigation associates, or transaction associates, or the summer associate kind of they you do with your rounds, I guess, in the different departments at a law firm. So it's a little bit of a different experience. But it was that summer where I realized this is a fascinating place to be. There are so many opportunities, and this is where I want to end up. But I was very disappointed when every single person I said this to in over and over said, well, you can't do this right out of law school. You got to get experience first. So how do you do that? It's not easy. When I graduated law school was 2011. The market was challenging. We were going through a recession. Things were not the glamorous, everybody gets a job out of law school. It was more challenging. And so I ended up getting an opportunity to clerk for the appellate division. And it was still challenging to kind of get a job after that. And one of the things I did to kind of set myself apart again was I happened to take 3 bars that year. I took New York and New Jersey, and then decided to set myself apart even more. I would take Philly, and that way I was more marketable to apply for jobs. And I know in this market, it's challenging for law students too to kind of get out there. The market has been down, things are different. So I'm not suggesting you have to take 3 bars in order to get a job, but my point is setting yourself apart and making yourself unique definitely helps to make yourself more marketable. And it helped in my case because I was able to get a job at a kind of mid-sized firm, Landman, Corsi, Blaine and Ford, which practiced in New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. So when they saw that they had somebody who was barred in all 3 states and they could utilize me for cases in all 3 states, it was marketable to them. I was useful to them because I could practice in all 3 states. So I worked at Landman Corsi for 3 years. They're an insurance coverage defense. To be quite honest, it was pretty boring. It was litigation. It was litigation for transportation companies. It was litigation for Amtrak, all defense litigation. There was some litigation for Anheuser-Busch, which was very interesting and exciting, and a little bit on the product side. But for the most part, it was a good job, not necessarily because the subject matter was interesting, but because I was on my feet. I was in court. I was taking depositions. I was doing arbitrations. I was doing mediations, and I really was able to get out there and get experience. Whereas again, some folks who were in larger firms as first year associates weren't doing as many of those things. And so my point for this is, don't always assume that you have to go to the big firm. There are pros and cons to all places. The mid-sized firm was able to get me great experience, even though I didn't have the big firm name. I was doing more than some of my colleagues who had great experiences and they're at their bigger firms, but weren't out there actually doing some of the litigation legwork like firsthand. And it was that experience, that legwork, which led me to Drinker Biddle, which was Drinker Biddle at the time and has since merged with Faegre Baker Daniels, and so now the firm is Faegre Drinker. But this was where I really dove into the product liability space and the pharma space. And I will tell you, going back to kind of my writing with Professor Carrier, it was the connections that I made with the co-author of our second piece that led me to network a bit and introduced me to a partner at Drinker who, we honestly were just networking. He said, actually, I happen to have a role open if you're interested in interviewing for it. And so it was that connection with the writing that I was doing at the time with Professor Carrier and another colleague that actually led me to this job, getting me invaluable experience as a product litigation attorney. Product litigation for pharmaceutical companies for 5 years at Faegre was my next stop. I did it was hard. I will be honest with you. It was not easy work. I certainly paid my dues. Any associate who's a litigation associate at a big firm, you pay your dues and you work hard, but you learn a ton. We were counsel for very large pharmaceutical companies like Johnson and Johnson, working directly with the business, working directly with the company and the clients because the litigation was so big that they needed the associates to work directly with the clients and do a lot of the work. But it's valuable, and it was valuable to me because you're helping to support pharmaceutical company defending its medication and for things that, in my case, I worked on one litigation for a very long time, and it was a large chunk of my work for a medication that did really, really help people and helped people overcome a very serious disease. And so very close with the company. And to me, that made me feel good. But it was there that I decided, I want to be closer to the business. I actually want to be close. I want to be on the other side where I'm actually closer to patients and helping patients. And I really would like to be in the in-house space on the other side as opposed to just defending the litigation. That is very hard to do. It's very hard to break into the in-house space, and it took me quite some time. And I will tell you that some of the things that helped me, and again, it really all stems back to the network that I created in writing this paper with Professor Carrier. It was some of the folks I had met along the way who were involved in that writing, or who were colleagues and of the people who I were writing with, are the ones who helped to introduce me to the folks in the pharma space because they were the ones who worked with the folks in the pharma space. And so it was my network, both with my classmates at Rutgers. I know people were so nice. Reaching out to classmates is a wonderful way, and keeping a network of classmates is a wonderful way to ensure that you kind of have someone to go to, and you're not just applying into a black hole of abyss, but you've got someone to actually talk to. So it was a combination of my classmates, the folks who I met when I was working with Professor Carrier, and also colleagues at my former jobs, both Len, Corsi, and Drinker, where I was able to network my way to meeting someone at BMS who was interested in me for a role. So it took a number of failed applications. I will tell you, it is not easy, but eventually I landed in a role at Bristol Myers Squibb it was related to quality law. And I will get into that a little bit in more detail here. So my first role at Bristol, I started there about 3.5 years ago in their quality group. And what does this mean? It means that I was one of the lawyers supporting anything related to the quality of a product. So that means if there was a government investigation a government inspection at one of the manufacturing sites, I would support that. If there's anything with respect to the product packaging, I'm sure you've all opened packaging, and there's bottles. There's the ones that you actually have to pop out the back that you can never open because they're so challenging to open. I would be involved in supporting that and some of the testing in order to make sure that those packaging were appropriate if there were issues with the packaging, to get those back on track. I supported if there was any type of manufacturing issue. So, for example, a failure at a manufacturing site, which is going to affect the supply of the product, I would support. And also, kind of most interesting, one of my favorite parts of the role actually was anytime there was any type of counterfeit product or diverted product, and we had to work with our corporate security team, I would support that from a legal perspective. So all of these things that you all probably think about when I'm speaking, that it makes sense. When I was in your shoes when I was a law student, I didn't even think about the fact that there's a lawyer who helps to support these things, right? Who thinks about the fact that there's actually a lawyer who helps to make sure that the packaging we have for our medicine is, compliant with regulations. So that's just kind of one area that was very different and something I didn't even know existed before I applied for the role. So I spent about 18 months in that role. And it was great because, again, I was very close to patients because I was actually helping to make sure that patients who were prescribed their medicine actually got their medicine and got their medicine that didn't have any quality issues with it. They got the right medicine um, that was for them. Um, but the thing about that role that I didn't love, and I wanted to change, which is why I moved roles, was I was not a strategic business partner. And what does that mean? It means they called me when something went wrong. I was the fixer. And what I wanted to really do was be a business partner, so that I could actually drive the business and help kind of drive how we actually get medicine to patients, right? And how patients actually get new medicines. And so I moved to our commercial department. And that is where I am now. I'm a commercialization and development counsel. So again, what does that mean? It means that um, I support a couple of products, but I have a few products that I support from a commercialization perspective in that I help the business when they are commercializing or developing their products. So things like when you go to the doctor's office or and you see patient materials that have any type of product on them, I help to review those materials. Commercials, drug commercials, those horrible commercials that have 30 seconds of content and then a minute and a half of warnings and precautions, I help to review those. Anytime we have any type of interaction with a patient or a doctor, there's of course a kickback risk from the company. And so I advise on any time we interact with patients or customers, whether it's, you know, a sales rep walking into an office or um, going to a going to a conference related to a certain disease area or gathering insights from physicians or even just trying to strategize how to launch a product and create a label. All of those things I help to support from more of a strategy perspective to mitigate legal risks. um, and so I like this role because I do more again on the strategy side. um, and that's kind of it in a nutshell. But I wanted to kind of give you a little bit of an idea as to what other opportunities there are in the actual pharma space, because this is two very small pieces of what can be a very large, complex puzzle in pharma. So there's a couple of kind of focus areas, and this is really just a drop in the bucket. There are so many more that you can think about if you are interested in the pharma space. That can, if you're interested in kind of thinking about what opportunities there are. So the first bucket I would put is investigations and litigation, right? There are so many different investigations or litigations related to pharma. There's product liability, which was my experience. There's also federal investigations, DOJ enforcement actions, anything, whistleblower actions, all that type of investigation and litigation is an opportunity or an area of expertise that lawyers have in the pharma space. There's also the IP space, right? You don't have to have your patent bar in order to work in IP and copyright in the pharma space. That was a very big misconception when I was a law student. Thought I had to take the patent bar. But I work with a lot of colleagues who are in our trademark and copyright teams who didn't take the patent bar. And they're just experts in trademark and copyright. And that is, by the way, a fascinating area of the law if you are interested. And I'm sure Professor Carrier has got a lot of insight into that. Then there's folks who work more on like life sciences and strategy. For example, post-approval activities, marketing, um, product promotion, advising on, again, manufacturing if something goes wrong and making sure that they're compliant with certain good manufacturing regulations. And then also good clinical practices, which is anything with related to product development, right? There are certain ways we have to run our clinical trials, and all of this has regulations that require some legal support. And then there's the transactional side, right? There's mergers and acquisitions. You hear about it all the time. I mean, you're probably not following that in the news, but it happens all the time where pharma companies merge, pharma companies buy other companies, they buy other drugs, or they have kind of co-development plans. And there is a ton of work in the mergers and acquisition space. Supply and distribution, again, things that we don't necessarily think about when we think about pharma, but drug needs to get from point A, which is from production to the end point, which is patient. And that sometimes leads to, distribution of how it's going to get there. There are there are different folks who maybe create the packaging, and there's different people who create the actual drug, and then there's different people who create the label, and all that needs to kind of get together and get to the patient. So there's this whole supply and distribution model that has to that needs support both internally and externally. And then there's third party agreements. Again, very similar. Sometimes we have people who are creating packaging for us. We have to have an agreement with them so that we understand that they have the right compliance measures and uh, and practices in place at their sites and facilities that align up with ours because they're creating some of our materials. So there's a whole host of folks from the external side who we rely on to support us internally. And then internally, and again, I kind of put this into three different buckets, but uh, it's probably slightly different for all different pharma companies, but there is just so much you can do once you're actually internal. If you're internal in a pharmaceutical company, so the first bucket I would put in is compliance, right? Many of my compliance colleagues are actually are legal. Some companies have compliance and legal kind of wrapped up in as one. Others separate them out. But it's so regulation focused that a lot of the folks in our compliance department again are lawyers because they're working on ensuring compliance with federal statutes. They're the ones working on internal investigations, which is it's almost like a mini litigation, right? Somebody does something wrong, you have to investigate to see if there needs to be some type of HR or compliance response. Um, Ethics. Every company has ethics, and lawyers are very valuable in creating kind of ethical policies and ensuring that companies practice ethically. And then creation of our SOPs, things like that, that help that help corporations run smoothly and compliantly. Then there's a whole regulatory sector, right? Those folks who help to support government filings, drug applications, who read the labels and make sure that they're not medical, but they're making sure that we comply with regulations when it comes to our labeling. Folks who help to support clinical developments, clinical trials, development of products, all the way from phase one through, or even discovery through promotion. And then lastly, product promotion. This is a highly regulated area. And I'm sure folks know that again from watching those commercials that have 1.5 minutes of warnings and precautions, but making sure that those product promotions are not false and misleading and abide by all of the requirements by FDA to ensure that they're accurate from the perspective of patients and HCPs. And then, in the actual like legal, I would call this the legal space. Um, Again, a whole host of opportunities from the commercial attorneys like myself to folks who actually support just the development of products, folks who support data and patient privacy, which is a huge area of legal risk, right? Making sure that there's HIPAA compliance. And you can imagine the kind of data that comes back and forth with a pharmaceutical company and particular patients that we have to make sure that we're maintaining controls to keep folks' data private. Then there's IP, which I'm sure everybody's aware of, but there's also a whole employment sector. There's HR, there's hiring, firing, all those kinds of like employment bias discrimination opportunities. There's corporate governance is another area where the all pharma companies, and some of this obviously is not limited to pharma, but any kind of big business, but corporate securities and corporate filings, you need attorneys to support those things. Transactions, again, we spoke about this before, whereas it's more of business development or any type of agreement that we might have with a wholesaler or a third party distributor, or even sometimes we have partnerships with other pharmaceutical companies, and we need to make sure that those partnerships have appropriate transactions. EHS, which is another area that I know some folks specialize in, is environmental health and safety. We are a manufacturing company, and there could be environmental risks associated with our manufacturing sites and even just any of our buildings. So making sure that there's support from a legal perspective for that. And then also philanthropy. Many pharmaceutical companies, BMS included, have philanthropic arms where they support patients who don't necessarily have the ability to afford medications, and not only of being able to afford medications, but also philanthropic efforts on behalf of the company. But this is a whole other area of legal where there's an area of support that can um, support the business. So I just kind of wanted to give some high level, and I'm happy to I wanted to make sure that I left plenty of time for questions and make sure that I was able to kind of give you kind of an idea of what opportunities there were, and also if you'd like, I can go into like a little bit more of my kind of day to day. But the purpose really I'm here for is I'm happy to answer questions and what can I do to make the space of the pharma world less amorphous from when I was sitting in your shoes again, and it just seemed like a shiny space to be.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Daryl. That was fascinating. I learned a ton, really interesting stuff. So the floor is open. Raise your hand if you have questions.